The air in the private study at Buckingham Palace was still, thick with the weight of the unsayable now said. Outside, the world saw a sovereign, composed, and steady, leading his nation in mourning. But here, alone with the Prime Minister on a September evening a week after the funeral, the armor had fallen away. King Charles III stood by the window, the London twilight casting long shadows across the room. His voice, when it came, was not the familiar, measured tone of his addresses, but a raw, confessional murmur that seemed to startle even him. "Her death," he said, not turning to face Liz Truss, "was the moment I've been fearing my entire life. It was more than a son's grief. It was the terrifying, long-deferred collision of a man with his destiny, the end of 70-year preparation for a role no one truly wants, and the beginning of a reign born not in jubilation, but in profound private dread. This is the story of that fear, of the private man forced into the ultimate public light, and of the first fragile steps of a king who had waited a lifetime, yet felt utterly unprepared. The call came in the deep quiet of a Scottish dawn. For Charles, the soft ring of the telephone on the bedside table at Burke Hall was a sound he had rehearsed in his mind for decades. Yet its reality was a physical blow. The voice on the other end, a senior aide at Balmoral, was calm but unequivocal. He must come at once. The journey through the mist-wrapped Aberdeenshire countryside, a route he knew by heart, felt surreal, a passage into a nightmare he was walking through awake. He had known this day would come. As a boy, he had watched his formidable mother, a constant, immutable force, and understood she was also mortal. As a man in his 70s, he had seen her gradual, graceful slowing. But knowledge was no armor. In the back of the car, his hands were steady, but his mind raced through a torrent of memories and terrifying future tenses. He was no longer the Prince of Wales. The title, his identity for over 7 decades, had just evaporated. He was, though it felt impossible, the king. At Balmoral, the ancient castle was hushed, a place of stone and history holding its breath. The medical staff's somber faces confirmed what the phone call had implied. He was shown to the room. His mother, the Queen, lay peacefully, the extraordinary stillness of her a shocking contrast to the boundless energy she had always possessed. In that quiet room, the private man, the son, collapsed inward with a grief so profound it was a silent scream. He held her hand, the same hand that had signed 1,000 documents, waved to millions, and once held his own small boy's hand. He wept for the loss of his mother, his guide, his only true predecessor in the strange life he led. But almost immediately, elbowing its way through the sorrow, came the cold, clamping fear of duty. The moment he had been fearing was not just her passing, but what began the very second she was gone. As he sat there, the first seed of a heavy, invisible crown settled onto his spirit. Within the hour, the machinery of state, impersonal and relentless, would begin to move. His private grief had to be compartmentalized, locked away in a vault deep inside, to be examined only in stolen moments. His first duty was to his title. The conflicting tides of son and sovereign had begun their relentless pull. The formalities were swift, conducted with a practiced efficiency that felt both respectful and brutal. The accession council, the proclamation, these were rituals scripted over centuries, designed to project continuity and stability. Charles performed them with a gravitas that came naturally, yet he felt like an actor playing a part in a play he had understudied for a lifetime, but was now forced to lead. The first God Save the King sung for him echoed in St. James's Palace, a sound so strange it seemed to belong to someone else. He saw the tears in the eyes of the courtiers, the public's stunned sorrow on the television screens, and he felt the immense, lonely weight of becoming the nation's focal point for grief. He was not just mourning. He was now the chief mourner, a role that required him to channel a nation's pain while managing his own. The fear here was not of incapability, but of emotional fracture. Could he hold the center? Could he be the steady, reassuring presence his mother had embodied, while inside he felt shattered? The letters of condolence piled up, world leaders offered their sympathies, and his new diary filled with obligations in a hand that was not yet accustomed to signing Charles R. Every interaction was a test, a first, and, through it all, the ghost of comparison loomed. How could he possibly follow the greatest act in royal history? The period between the accession and the state funeral was a surreal marathon conducted in a global spotlight. Charles was now the conductor of a vast, complex national event, a ceremony that had to be perfect. Meetings blurred into one another, with the Earl Marshal, with palace advisors, with the Prime Minister. He pored over plans, approved music, and offered suggestions with a surprising clarity of focus. The work was a refuge, a distraction from the gnawing emptiness. In these strategic discussions, his own decades of thought about the monarchy's future surfaced. He insisted the funeral must reflect both the timeless tradition the Queen embodied and a subtle, modern accessibility. He spoke of the need for inclusivity, for recognizing the changed world over which he now reigned. Yet in quiet moments, the fear whispered. Was he honoring her legacy or inadvertently drawing comparisons? Would his reign, beginning in such profound sadness, ever escape the long shadow of the Elizabethan age? His family became both a comfort and a concern. He watched his sons, William and Harry, united in their grief, and felt a fierce, protective pride alongside a new, formal distance with William, now the Prince of Wales. With Camilla, now his queen consort, he found his only true harbor. She had seen a man behind the prince for decades, and now she saw the king behind the man. She offered no grand advice, just a steady, unwavering presence, a reminder of the person he was when the crowns were put away. It was she who ensured he ate, who guarded the few moments of quiet where he could simply be a grieving husband and son. The family dynamics were played out in public view. The unified front at Westminster Hall, the walking procession behind the gun carriage. Every step was scrutinized. Charles felt the pressure not just to lead a nation, but to hold his own family together as its new head, a role for which his own tumultuous family history offered no perfect blueprint. The fear here was of personal failing under public glare. Could he be the patriarch the institution required? The day of the funeral was a masterpiece of somber pageantry, a final, breathtaking tribute to his mother. Charles sat in the ancient choir of Westminster Abbey, the crown of Scotland placed before him on the coffin, and listened to the haunting melodies. In that sacred space, surrounded by world leaders and the grieving public, the conflicting tides within him reached their peak. As the lone piper's lament faded into the stone, a profound, quiet certainty began to displace the panic. He saw not just an end, but a transfer. The love and respect emanating from the crowds, from the silent soldiers, from the global audience, was not just for the queen who was gone, but for the institution she had protected, an institution now in his care. The moment he had feared was passing, transformed by ritual and collective will into something else, a beginning. The dread did not vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of resolve. He had watched, he had grieved, and now he must work. The first audience with the Prime Minister in his new capacity was, by design, a formal affair. The constitutional wheels were turning. But the meeting a week after the funeral, requested by the king, was of a different nature. Liz Truss, new in her own role, found herself in the king's private study, a room more personal library than throne room. The king, no longer in the stiff uniform of public events, seemed weary, etched with the strains of the past fortnight. He spoke of the funeral's success, thanked her for the government support, and then the conversation lulled. Gazing out at the darkening gardens, he gave voice to the core of his anxiety. The moment she died, he confessed, his voice low, it was the moment I've been fearing my entire life. For Truss, it was a startling glimpse behind the imperial curtain. This was not the distant monarch of protocol, but a human being articulating a burden of almost mythological proportions. He spoke not of policy, but of psyche, not of power, but of preparedness, or the haunting lack thereof. He elaborated, not in a rush of emotion, but with the measured tone of a man who had spent a lifetime in analysis. He feared not the work, but the loneliness at the pinnacle. He feared the loss of the freedom to champion causes, to speak his mind on issues like architecture or the environment, as he had done as prince. He feared becoming a symbol so polished he ceased to be a person. Most of all, he feared that his life's long preparation, the endless meetings, the state papers, the tours, had been a mirage, failing to truly equip him for the sheer, stark reality of wearing the crown. Truss listened, a rare witness to a sovereign's vulnerability. Her role was not to advise, but to hear. In the British Constitution, the monarch is a mirror to the government, and in that moment, Charles was reflecting a very human truth about the price of duty. The confession was not a sign of weakness, but an essential act of naming the fear, of dragging it into the light where it could be seen and perhaps managed. The meeting ended with a return to formality, the unseen line between sovereign and minister respectfully recrossed. But something had shifted for Charles. Articulating the fear had, paradoxically, diminished its power. It was now a known quantity, a part of the job description, rather than a terrifying phantom. In the days that followed, he threw himself into the tangible work. He read his first King's Speech draft, met with ambassadors, held investitures. Each event was a step on a new path, a brick laid in the foundation of his reign. He began, cautiously, to impose his own stamp. A lighter schedule where possible, a focus on fewer, more sustained engagements, a conscious effort to allow his natural curiosity and empathy to show through the ceremonial. The fear was now a silent companion, a whisper of caution, not a shout of paralysis. He started to see his long apprenticeship not as a futile wait, but as a unique repository of experience. He had met every significant global figure of the past 50 years, understood the intricacies of countless charities, and witnessed the evolution of Britain from empire to commonwealth to a modern, multicultural nation. This was a depth of knowledge no new constitutional monarch had ever possessed. The first months of the reign were a period of quiet, determined calibration. The world watched for signs of the old meddling prince in the new king's actions. What they saw was a subtle evolution. His first Christmas broadcast, filmed at St. George's Chapel, was telling. He spoke of his mother's legacy of faithful service and of his own belief in the power of light overcoming darkness. His language was more spiritual, more personally reflective than his mother's had often been. He did not announce grand new projects, but he visited food banks and youth centers, his conversations less ceremonial, more genuinely inquisitive. The fear of being trapped as a mere symbol was being actively, quietly combated by these small acts of connection. He also began the delicate internal work of streamlining the monarchy, a recognition of the need for a more focused, cost-effective institution, a process he had long believed in, but could only now enact as sovereign. A significant test came with his first state visit, a trip to a Commonwealth nation. It was a success, but the more telling moment was a walkabout in a rainy Welsh town shortly before. An elderly woman, her eyes filled with tears, grasped his hand and said, "We loved your mum, but we're right behind you, boyo." It was a simple, heartfelt sentiment, but for Charles, it was a lifeline. It was public acceptance, not as a substitute for Elizabeth, but as himself. The monolith of the crown was beginning, fractionally, to accommodate the character of Charles. The unity shown by the nation in grief was slowly transforming into a grant of goodwill for the new reign. He learned to draw strength from this, to let the public's quiet support temper the internal anxiety. Now, looking towards the future, the fear has not disappeared, but it has been metabolized into duty. The king understands that the moment he feared was, in fact, a threshold. On one side was the man defined by waiting, by potential, by criticism and expectation. On the other is the man defined by action, by service, by the relentless, daily fulfillment of an oath. The shadow of his mother remains, but he has begun to see it not as a stifling darkness, but as a foundational shade from which his own tree can grow. His reign will be different. It must be. It is born of an era of anxiety, of fractured public discourse, of environmental and social challenges he has long warned about. The private man's passions for harmony, sustainability, and interfaith dialogue are now slowly, carefully being woven into the public fabric of his role. The confession to his prime minister was the end of one journey, the long dread of arrival, and the true start of another, the long, hard road of ruling. King Charles III, the man who had a lifetime to prepare, is finally doing the only thing that could ever truly prepare him. He is being the king. One day, one audience, one act of service at a time, he is building his reign not on the fear of the moment, but on the work that comes after it. The first year of a new reign was a quiet storm of paper and protocol. For King Charles, the fear he had spoken of to the Prime Minister did not vanish. Instead, it changed shape. It became a constant, low hum in the background of his life, like the distant sound of traffic beyond the palace walls. It was no longer the sharp terror of the moment his mother died. Now it was the steady pressure of being the one who could not make a mistake. His days began early, often before the sun was up. He would sit at his desk, a simple wooden table piled high with the famous red boxes. These boxes contained the secret papers of state, the daily business of the government. Reading them was his most important duty. He had done it for decades as Prince of Wales, but now every initial he put on a document, every note he scribbled in the margin, carried the weight of the crown. He took immense care. He asked questions. He wanted to understand not just the what, but the why. Sometimes his private secretaries would see him staring out the window, a paper in his hand, his brow furrowed. He was thinking about the people affected by the dry words on the page. A new hospital, a change in a farming law, a report on struggling schools. He felt the responsibility like a physical weight on his shoulders. The public saw a king performing his ceremonies. They saw him in uniform bestowing medals. They saw him in a suit opening parliament. They saw him in a warm coat visiting a community center. They saw the figurehead. What they did not see was the man learning to balance that figurehead with his own heart. He had spent a lifetime speaking his mind on issues he cared about. He had been called an activist, a meddler, even a nuisance. Now he had to learn the hardest lesson of being sovereign. He had to remain silent. His opinions, so freely given for 70 years, were now locked inside him. This was perhaps the greatest personal change, and it chafed like a new shoe that would never be broken in. He found his outlet in the smaller, human moments. During a visit to a food bank in South London, he did not just shake hands and move on. He stopped. He asked a volunteer how long she had been helping. He asked a young mother, quietly waiting in line, what brought her here. He listened to her answer, his head tilted, his full attention on her. He did not offer solutions or make promises. He simply showed that he saw her. These were the moments that felt real to him. They were a connection to the people he served, a reminder that the papers in the red boxes were about lives like hers. Camilla, the queen consort, was his anchor in this new life. She had a way of making the grand palaces feel like a home. She would join him for a quiet lunch, steer the conversation away from work, and make him laugh with a story about their grandchildren or their dogs. In her presence, he could sometimes forget he was the king and just be Charles. As the seasons turned, the first major test of his reign arrived. It was not a war or a crisis. It was the planning for his coronation. The committee meetings were long and detailed. Every tradition was examined. Every symbol was discussed. Some advisors pushed for a ceremony that was exactly like his mother's, a direct copy to show stability and continuity. But Charles felt a deep unease with this. The world was not the same as it was in 1953. Britain was not the same. He was not the same. He listened to the traditional arguments, but in his heart, he knew his coronation had to reflect the king he wanted to be and the nation he now led. He made small, firm decisions that sent ripples through the ancient planning process. He wanted the ceremony shorter, to be respectful of people's time. He wanted the guest list to include more representatives from all faiths and community groups. He insisted the music include modern compositions alongside the glorious old hymns. He asked if the odes he would take could be made to feel more relevant, more connected to the duty of serving all people. There was resistance. Change in this thousand-year-old institution moved at a glacial pace. But he was patient and persistent. This was not the impatient Prince of Wales pushing for a cause. This was the king, thoughtfully steering the monarchy forward. He did not want to break tradition. He wanted to breathe new life into it, to make sure it could survive and have meaning for his grandchildren's generation. The personal toll of the year was heavy. He missed his mother every day. Her absence was a quiet room in his life. He would sometimes pick up the phone to ask her a question, only to remember she was not there. He had no one who truly understood the peculiar burden he carried. Only one other person on earth had known this job, and she was gone. He leaned on his son, William, the new Prince of Wales. Their relationship began to change, evolving from father and son into something new, something that also included the heir and the monarch. They met for regular talks. Charles shared some of the pressures, not to burden William, but to prepare him. He saw in William a steadiness, a modern sensibility that gave him great hope for the future. It was a comfort to know the institution would one day be in such safe hands. A small incident in the spring showed how his inner struggle was shifting. He was on a walkabout in a small town in Wales. A man in the crowd, his voice loud and angry, began shouting about the cost of the monarchy. Security moved in, but Charles held up a hand. He walked towards a man, not away. He did not get too close, but he made eye contact. "I hear your frustration," he said, his voice calm. "These are difficult times for everyone." The man, surprised, stopped shouting. He mumbled something else, but the anger had leaked out of him. Charles nodded and moved on. Later, an aide said it had been a risk. Charles replied simply. He had a right to be heard. Ignoring him would have been worse. The fear of confrontation was being replaced by a cautious commitment to engagement, however brief. By the time the first anniversary of his accession arrived, the king asked for no ceremony. He spent the day quietly at Highgrove, his beloved garden. It was a place that had always grounded him, a place where he had dug the earth with his own hands and watched things grow over decades. As he walked between the flower beds, he thought about the year. The fear was still there. He doubted it would ever fully leave. But it was no longer a monster in the dark. It was a familiar companion, a reminder to be careful, to be thoughtful, to be kind. He had not transformed into a completely different person. He was still himself, with all his passions and his worries. But he was learning to wear the crown without letting it crush the man underneath. He had started to find a rhythm. The work was endless, but he found pieces of it he loved. He enjoyed meeting the young winners of awards, hearing their ideas. He found deep satisfaction in his weekly audience with the Prime Minister, where he could ask sharp questions and draw on his vast experience of world affairs. He was slowly, carefully putting his own stamp on the role. It was not about big announcements. It was about a look, a question, a moment of genuine connection. It was about a coronation plan that looked to the future while honoring the past. That evening, he had dinner with Camilla. They talked about the garden, about a book they were both reading. For a few hours, the red boxes were forgotten. The fear was silent. He was just a man, tired but content, sitting with his wife at the end of a long year. He knew the next day the boxes would return. The meetings would fill his diary. The eyes of the world would be upon him again. But he had survived the first year. He had faced the moment he had always feared, and he had not broken. He was still standing. And in that simple fact, he found a small, steady kind of courage. The reign of King Charles III was no longer a terrifying idea. It was his life, and he was determined to live it one day at a time, doing the job he was born to do in his own way.